Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop, and today I wanted to talk about another thing that you should look at if you're considering buying a older or vintage acoustic guitar. And for that matter, this is also applicable to basically any fretted instrument. And that is how to avoid buying an instrument that's going to need major fretwork right off the bat. So let's talk about things that you should look at with frets. So number one, we want to look for pitting, and that means places where the strings have cut into the frets and caused pits. Another would be how high are the frets? Are they really worn? Does it look like these have seen several level crown and polishes? And if they're worn, are they still in good shape? And another thing obviously is if the frets are level or not. And the thing about fretwork is that fretwork is another one of those things that unfortunately a lot of older instruments need, and unfortunately is kind of a high dollar mark thing to have done. Pretty much no matter what you're having done on frets, it's going to be it's going to kind of hit your wallet a little bit. I mean, you can get a refret ranging from stainless steel at like 400 something to normal nickel silver frets at 300 something. You can get level crown and polishes, which are generally going to be around like 100, 160. Even going and deburring fret ends is going to be a little bit of money. And so yeah, this is something that can really be a bummer if you just bought a guitar thinking that it was a really good deal. So let's go ahead and take a look at these frets here, and I'll kind of show you what I'm looking at, because this is a pretty good example of a number of things to watch out for. So one thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to zoom in here on these frets in the first position. Sorry for the shaky camera here. I'm trying to get you in there so you can see what I see. But you see these pits and how nasty they are? Well, these are the kind of thing that can cause fret buzz, and unfortunately these are all pretty bad. And this guitar here isn't in here to get these worked on today. This was just in here for a setup, but if this were a guitar that I was getting ready to sell, I would not be putting it on the wall in this condition, just because these are really, really bad. There's another problem with the frets being this bad, and that is that sometimes when you have pits and frets like that, you can do a level crown and polish, which means going in and leveling all the frets and then re-crowning them, and then polishing them out. But in this case, when we turn this guitar over and look at the profiles that these frets have, these are right down on the board. These frets are not going any lower than where they're at right now, and I probably would not have taken these down as far as this even. These frets are barely there. They are going to be difficult to pull as is. They are not going to protect the board. There's numerous problems, including tone and even intonation, that can be caused by this sort of thing. What I mean by tone is just that there's not a lot of height here, so there's just not going to be a lot of meat and energy going into the neck. And I mean, that, you could take that criticism here or there, but that's one thing that's happening. Another thing that's happening that more people will probably care about is just that since these are so close to the board, there's just no way to really crown these. And so the surface of these frets is going to be fairly flat, meaning that the contact point that the string has is not going to be in the middle of that fret. It's going to be somewhere else, and that's going to cause problems for the intonation of the guitar. One other thing, and this is something that you see on older guitars. You don't see it on this one, unfortunately, and so I can't show you what I'm talking about, but if you encounter this, you'll definitely know it. And that is that the fretboards on instruments shrink over time. And what that can cause is the fret ends to kind of poke out the sides of the guitar. On guitars where the fret tangs, let me kind of show you. The fret tangs on this guitar are covered up, but if you see little metal strips underneath here, and you see a bunch of white in the finish, it means that that process has already kind of started because those frets have pushed the finish out. But if you run your finger along the board here and you just feel like a wave kind of thing, and there's a little bulge next to each one of those frets, that's something that you have going on. And that's something that you really do kind of want to get remedied if you want the guitar to play comfortably. And in some cases, really older guitars, these frets can start coming out and being kind of hazardous. They can cut your hands up and be a real problem. And so that's not something that should be taken lightly if you find it on an instrument that you're thinking about buying. And maybe ask the person to take it to a shop and get it taken care of first, or maybe ask them to knock off the amount that repair is going to cost. to maybe call around and get a really good idea for what that cost is going to be. I'm going to go ahead and pause this video for a second and come back with some paper so that I can draw this fret crown thing so that you all understand exactly what it is that I'm talking about. Alright, so I've got a whiteboard here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a healthy fret. So this is a fret that has been crowned. It's nice and curved on top, and that's ideally what you want to see in older guitars. That may or may not be what you're looking at, but this is kind of what we've got going on with this guitar. And let me show you the difference. So the difference is that when you fret a string on this fret, you see that the string is basically coming to that contact point, roughly dead center on that fret, and that's really good for intonation, because that's, these fret slots are cut with a lot of precision, and really you want that string to be making contact right where that fret slot was cut, because if it's not, that means that the math just doesn't work to give you the note that you really want there. And in this case, what's happening is that the string is kind of going over and then breaking, and the middle of this fret is here, and yet the string is kind of making contact over here. And on top of that, let me go ahead and illustrate this a little bit better. Maybe do a bigger illustration. On top of that, what can happen, this is really difficult to draw, so bear with me. What can happen is that you end up with this little gap here too, which can sometimes cause notes to sound kind of dead, or maybe even give you kind of a little bit of a sitar type buzz. And that's definitely not a place that you want to be with an instrument that you just bought. So the fret crowning is actually kind of a big deal. I see this ignored all the time. I get people in with guitars that they've just bought off of Craigslist, off of Reverb, yada yada yada, and a lot of them come in with fret issues along these lines. So one other thing too that most of you will know something about is the levelness of frets. So let's go ahead and talk about that. This is a fret rocker, and this one is a Stu Mac one. You can get them from other places. Basically what this is a straight edge that's machined really, really flat on on a bunch of sides, and so that I can bridge 3 frets like this and kind of rock it back and forth to see if there's any rocking. Let me show you how this works. So when you're looking for high frets, you want to bridge 3 frets with a line, and that line is your straight edge. And so the thing is that if this fret in the middle is high, on one side or the other, you're going to end up with this kind of seesaw thing going on, and that's how you detect high frets with one of these fret rockers. These fret rockers are kind of expensive, but if you're in the habit of going out and buying a bunch of acoustic instruments, this would be like, the one kind of expensive luthier tool that I might recommend grabbing, just to check out frets when you are looking at buying an instrument, and this is something that it can help out with. There are different ways to look for high frets as well. Sometimes in extreme cases you can even look for them using the string as a straight edge, but a lot of times you're dealing with measurements that are maybe 1/1000th of an inch, or maybe sub-1,000th of an inch. You may talk 10,000ths of an inch in some cases. So it's not a skill that I would prefer to talk about in this video, just because for one thing, I sight down frets here, but I always verify what I'm looking at with a fret rocker. And so mainly what I would say is that if you have nice low action on that guitar, play it and see if there's any kind of hints of buzzes places, and really give those strings a nice hard pluck, and see if you can get that, see if you can get it to buzz in any of the points on the fretboard. And that's really going to be your indicator as to whether or not there is a high fret and whether or not that high fret is a problem. Because the other thing too is that sometimes you can have high frets that, depending on where they are on the board and the nature of the neck and yada yada variables, you might even have a high fret that's just not a problem. But if you have a fret that's a problem, obviously it's going to be causing a problem, and that problem is going to usually come in the form of a buzz or in fretting out. Sometimes maybe even hitting the wrong note. I mean, if this fret is like way the hell up here, and you try to fret this note here, you might end up with this guy instead. So again, this is just kind of a real bummer to end up with if you just bought the guitar, because maybe you bought a guitar for a really really good price. You take it to somebody like me for a setup, and then I or your repair shop ends up giving you a call and saying, hey, well, as soon as we lowered this action, the frets became a problem. Maybe there were some high frets that didn't manifest until the action got brought down, which is usually something that needs to be done on a used older guitar. And then you're in it for the setup cost as well as some fret work. In the case of this guitar here, with just as how worn these frets are and how low they are, let me go ahead and show you what I'm dealing with here. I'm dealing with one of these Takamine clones, which are cool guitars, but they're not necessarily like super valuable or anything. This guitar I'd be recommending a full refret on, just because all of these frets are really really low. All of them are really really worn, and I just don't think that there's going to be another option for this guy if we're trying to get it playing its best. If this guitar were going on my sale wall, I would definitely be doing a refret on it. I would be doing that before anybody bought it, just because I want people who buy my guitars here to end up with really really nice playable instruments that don't have a lot of issues. Unfortunately, that mentality is kind of rare for people who are in the business of selling used and older guitars and student guitars, etc. On that note, having just mentioned student guitars, look for this on cheap guitars. Look for all of the fret problems that you can encounter on cheap guitars, because one other thing that I'll say in this video is that another really really common thing that I see is people buying cheaper guitars, and I'm hesitant to call out names here, but certainly with certain lower end brands, and this goes for guitars, banjos, mandolins, and everything else with frets, I will get in instruments that maybe cost $120 new right out of the box, made in China, made in Indonesia, or wherever it is that they come from, and those frets are bad. And so, some student instrument will get brought in here for a setup. Maybe the teacher recommended that they get it set up, and then I take a look at it and realize that it's not going to take a setup, and a lot of the problems that they're dealing with are the bad frets. Well, and then you're into the same thing where you're spending a lot of money, especially with a student guitar, on a guitar that just may not be worth the effort. I wanted to grab this instrument here so that I could address a few more things before I let you go. And one of those things is frets that don't look like they've been worked at all. On the topic of cheaper instruments, one thing that I unfortunately see a lot of with really really low-end instruments is that frets will be installed but not worked. They will bevel the edges and they will go ahead and install the fret, but there's no work that goes in on top. And let me talk about why that's bad. Well, when I do a refret, I'll install the frets, bam, 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 bam. Well, and then I'll trim the edges, and I'll do all the deburring of the fret ends and everything, and dress those really nicely. And then I'll go in and I'll level these frets so that they're all on a nice plane. Well, when you do that, you end up with frets that are flat on top because you've mowed down some material here. And what you need to do is go in and then recrown the frets. Well, and see, that's a lot of work, and so a lot of these companies that make really really low-end instruments for the intent of selling them for very little money, this is just more time than they want to spend on them. I bet that some of these places give these guys maybe 10-20 minutes to fret a guitar. Well, and when I was doing production work, we were not expected to have a fret job done for about 3 hours. So, different people are going to have different numbers depending on, how they do this and, how fast they are. But this is a big deal, because if you don't do a fret job properly, and you don't do the leveling and you don't do the crowning, well, you end up with problems. Another one that I'll see sometimes, and this also includes, unfortunately, some higher end manufacturers too. They'll go in and they'll level the frets out, but they'll leave the tops flat, and this is something that you encounter on guitars that might range, $1,000 or in the upper hundreds, and unfortunately, you end up with the same intonation problems and the same kind of sitar buzzing problems, and I'm not going to name names, but generally speaking, customers who I see with these guitars are usually complaining of the same issues, and that's intonation and dead notes and buzzing. And you know, they might have a brand new guitar and that it comes in here and then needs crowning work and polishing and everything else. And that's, you know, not a place that you want to be in either. So the next thing that I kind of want to talk about, and this is something that's kind of hard to see, and I was kind of debating whether or not I wanted to go over this, and that is lifted frets. So, you know, fret has a profile that looks something like a mushroom. At least this is a modern fret. And so this tang here, this portion here, is called the tang, goes into a slot and anchors there. And in modern instrument building, most people tend to use kind of a combination of the frets friction, so they're little teeth. If you looked at a profile view of this tang, so you know, here's the fret. This is a really bad illustration, but this part here is this guy up here, and this part down here is this guy here, the fret tang. They're little triangle teeth that are down here, or sometimes people hit this with a... This was a thing back in the 70s and 60s with some Japanese guitars and other guitars, but sometimes people would put little teeth on them with chisels. And those are meant to, you know, bite into the fret slot. And then usually with modern instruments, people will supplement that with a little bit of glue, and so people will use either epoxy or super glue or something to hold the fret down in. Well, and you know, on cheaper guitars and sometimes in older instruments, they didn't use the glue, and they were relying completely on the friction provided by the fret being in that slot to hold the fret down. And well, you know, wood expands and it contracts, and as it ages, sometimes the fretboard will let go of a fret. And so on older guitars, it's usually because of that. On newer guitars, sometimes people just want to skimp, or maybe they don't get the fret down all the way. Maybe, you know, variables. Again, lots of things can contribute. But sometimes what you end up with, and I'm going to do an illustration here and try to show you what it is that I'm looking for. Sometimes what you end up with is a fret that may be seated something like this, and so maybe there's a little bit of tang down in there, but there's this gap underneath. And a really fast way to spot this is by looking at the profile of the fret. Because see, if you look at this fret here next to it, you can see that it's like, you know, just about the same height as the one next to it, but it's got a lot more material here on the side, so it's going to appear a lot more brighter. It's going to be a lot more obvious that there's a fret end there, whereas this guy here is going to be obviously a lot narrower. And so if you see a little fret end next to a big fret end, that's usually a pretty good indicator that something has lifted. Maybe it's been polished out. So something that you want to do when you see a lifted fret is push on it. If it's a lifted fret and it's not causing problems, well, you know, it's definitely not ideal, but you know, it's probably going to be something that's playable. But if you push down on that fret and it's moving, yeah, that is a lifted fret that's stationary is not a problem. But if you push down on that fret and it moves up and down, that's really going to be a problem, because what's going to end up happening is that though it may appear to be level here, and you could even take a fret rocker to it, and if you weren't applying any pressure, you might not even realize it. Realize that this was happening, but as soon as you depress the string here, the string will totally take that down, and then you end up with this fret seems high now because it's going to buzz on that fret or fret out on that fret because this one's getting pushed down, if that makes any sense. So that would be one thing. You know, another thing that I would definitely recommend looking for, particularly on, you know, older instruments and cheaper instruments, because it's something that I kind of see a lot of, and it's, you know, just another one of those things that's a real bummer. Generally for fixing that, you know, if you were dealing with, you know, really extreme case, kind of like the one that I had illustrated where you had like a really low fret next to a really high fret, you know, might actually opt to pull that fret and then do, like, you know, some leveling and crowning and everything to get everything back where it needs to be, which is expensive and annoying. If it's a fret that can be pushed down and then be level, you know, that can be fixed with a fairly simple fix that I'm not going to talk about in this video. But yeah, definitely look out for that as a problem. that you may encounter on an instrument. Never make assumptions about fretwork when looking at instruments. Always really take a critical eye to it, and I'd say take a critical eye to the frets more than just about anything else that you're looking at. You know, if it comes to any fretted instrument, just because that's going to be one territory that you know, how many frets does the guitar have? It has, you know, 18 to 24 frets. Well, if one of them is really bad, that's just a real bummer, because most, you know, you're going to have to go in and do major fretwork. So again, just don't assume that they're good. Take a really critical eye to things that you're looking at. Don't assume that that things are going to be okay, you know, or if you have high action, that it can just be lowered without, you know, taking the possibility of bad frets into account. I think that just about covers everything that I'm prepared to talk about in this video. I will have more of these as I get more things in that have things that I want to point out to prospective guitar buyers. Hopefully going to turn this into kind of a series of videos. So hopefully this will help people in, you know, help people in buying instruments that are going to treat them really well. This has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. If you are in Seattle and you have need of some guitar repair, setup work, or whatever, give me a call and I'll be happy to hook you up. I have lots of other videos. Check out my website, check out my channel, and if you found this helpful, you know, which I hope that you did, I hope that you tune into my other videos as well. Thank you for watching.